Hey everybody, Paul here once again, and in this tutorial I'm going to be taking a photo reference for the purposes of creating a comic style portrait. Now this is a question I get asked quite often, so without any further ado, let's jump into Blender and let's start. So when you open up Blender 2.83 for the first time, you'll get your customary default scene, and this is all well and good and we could change the layout if we wanted to, but there are some hidden defaults which we should really take advantage of. So the first thing you want to do, especially if you're going to be working in Grease Pencil, is to go to File, New, and select 2D Animation. All of a sudden, you have got a preset which is custom ready for you to get drawing. I can straight away draw, little whatever here. And it's already looking through a camera, and I've got my tool sets, and I've got these neat little collections with a stroke in one and the camera in the other. I've even got a Grease Pencil timeline down the bottom. Now, what this has actually gone and done is just given you some defaults, like a world setting that is easier to draw on. It's got a forward-facing camera that is set to 90 degrees in the X and about 12 meters away from the origin. And it's even made a few things invisible, such as the 3D cursor, which is set at the world origin. If you want to see it, you just have to go to Viewport Overlays, and you can click on anything that you might need, such as a 3D cursor, or maybe you want to see the grid when you're in front view. As you see, the camera is kind of annoying when you're in front view, and so this little collection over here is very handy to untick just to make it invisible. The stroke object has already been created with lines and fills and a set of materials ready for you to apply and draw with. And so we don't have to set any of that up. Now I'm just going to delete everything here and go into object mode, because the next thing I want to talk about is adding references. What we're going to do is going to go Shift A, Image, Reference. Now you'll see that there is reference and background. I'm going to add both to show you that they're technically one and the same, just with different settings. Let's go ahead and add a reference picture. I'm going to go over to my reference pics and select the one that I'll be working with here. I'm going to move this over to the side here, and I'm going to go Shift A, add a background picture, and add the same picture. So what is the difference? They kind of look the same, and I've deliberately enabled this grid to help us differentiate between the two. If we select one and we go down to its object data properties, you will see some very interesting things, such as the depth and display. On the reference is set to default and both. The background, however, the depth is set to back and the side is set to front, and the display is only set to orthographic. So that means if we swing into perspective mode, the background image suddenly disappears. Selecting the background image and setting the display to perspective, suddenly we get it back. Now swinging this around the other side, you will notice that the background image now isn't visible from behind. That's because the side that is shown is only set to front. The reference image is set to both. Similarly, the reference image has got a depth set to default. Now default just means that in whatever view, it's going to knock out something in the background, and in this case, default is only knocking out anything behind it, whereas the background, because its depth is set to back, means that anything is overlaid on top of it. So to demonstrate, selecting the reference pic and setting its default to front, now you can see that it's knocked out that floor grid. This sits in front of anything else that is displayed. Now, it doesn't matter which you put in as your reference. You can always change these settings to suit your purposes. So for instance, we can delete this background picture, set this back to its center, and we can set this depth to back. And we will actually need both sides showing at some point, so we're going to leave the sides to both, and I'm also going to leave the display orthographic and perspective ticked. The other thing that we might want to do is tinker with the transparency. By ticking this, you can make this less opaque, which obviously is a really good idea for when you're drawing over a reference. So now with our grease pencil stroke selected, we can make sure that we're in draw mode. And with all the defaults as it is, you're going to go ahead and do this. You're going to draw a line and you're going to wonder, why does my line look like this? Let's take a look at some of our default settings. Yes, we know that our solid stroke is actually set to black. It may not be on self-overlap. It's a good idea to have that ticked. But the strength is set to 0.6, which means it's going to be less opaque than if it was set at 100%. Okay, so you can sort of see over here. What we're actually seeing here in material preview in the viewport shading is an interaction between the grease pencil and the world color. And this is sort of knocking out an alpha through our reference image. All we have to do is go into solid viewport shading. This solves our problem, and for the beginning steps, it is probably best to work in this. Now, the one caveat here is that you're going to have to work in materials. If I was to, for example, enable our vertex color mode, and let's set that to say like a red line, I'm in solid mode, I'm drawing my stroke, you're still only going to see black. The vertex coloring only becomes visible in the material preview and above. So if we went there, you'll see that this stroke is indeed red. But we are going to get that problem that if we drop that stroke, you're going to get this really weird looking thing and you won't sort of see through to the reference image, which is kind of what we want. So for starters, what I recommend you do is create a solid stroke material, if you want to work with the color pencil, to the color that you want. All right, so let's go ahead and erase all of those. And let's do just that. I'm going to create a new material based on solid stroke. Let's hit that 2. Let's call this red line. And let's change the base color to something like a maroony type of color. That's generally what a red line pencil looks like. Making sure we're in solid mode, we probably don't need this toolbox right here. We can begin to draw. Now, because this is going to be a stylized drawing, okay, we start by putting in our construction lines. We put in everything that is going to be basically what we'll then be drawing over. Now, at any point you want to sort of do the flip reverse method, you just go Control 1, which gives us the other side. And once you're happy with your draft, that's when we can make our empty invisible. I'm just going to drag it down to the camera layer, which is hidden. Okay. And we've got a pretty good trace. And because this is creating a stylized version, I'm going to switch the edit mode to points, select my proportional editing tool, and see what I've got there. So I want to make these eyes a little bit larger, let's say. All right, so now we have something that is a little bit more stylized, a little bit more anime, and you can sort of go to town with, you know, how much you want to sort of push and pull and stretch and do all those sorts of things with stylizing. But generally, just sort of exaggerating the features ever so slightly to make it slightly more cartoony is generally how I approach this. If you want, you can do like a second pencil pass before you do inks. Maybe drop the opacity on that one. Lock off those layers as always. Draw. I might end up working with the ink pen tool on red line, and I might enable my stabilize stroke, but sort of just lower the settings a little bit, just so that I can see what I can do about these shapes. And then you can begin to sort of draw in some shapes based on your reference. And so now, happy with those pencils. Going forward now, the process is basically just adding layers and adding inks and colors. And so I'll continue to time-lapse this. At this point, it's quite safe to kind of just make that empty invisible and continue to work on this image. Let's go ahead and add a new layer, call it inks. Let's drop the opacity of these pencils here. And let's, just working in the inks layer in draw mode, let's go back to solid stroke, making sure that our stabilize features are set, our radius is nice and big, and our strength is at 100% without any pressure sensitivity on that. And time to get to work. Now, when filling in solids, it's sometimes a good idea to go into solid fill. And for this purpose, because we're no longer using the reference, it's quite safe to go into material settings output and switch over to vertex mode and set the color of the fill to black. Now, it's important to make sure that your mode is set to stroke and fill, so it will affect both strokes and fills, obviously. And let's go ahead and draw in these eyebrow shapes. There's one. Here's two. It's also sometimes a good idea to use shapes, especially for things like eyes. So I'll just go back to solid stroke here and let's draw in. Obviously the thickness is a little bit too dense, so we've got to go down maybe even further to something like 5 or 6. And try drawing this. Now we've got these nice little handles on these circles. So I'm going to create one eye here. And then I'm going to switch this over to solid fill with the material. And I'm going to create another circle here for the iris. And sort of set that there. And I can always go into edit mode, selecting one vertex on this circle and hitting L to select the links. With Alt-S, I can actually scale up or scale down the thickness as I need it. And so, for instance, if I wanted to, I could even scale part of that, that curve. And so we've got this bottom bit a little bit thicker than the top bit. Of course, I've got my proportional editing mode on, so this is working quite nicely. And now this iris I can reposition, maybe rescale. And then when I like what I've done with one eye, I can select all of those vertices by clicking on one vertex, clicking on another vertex, hitting L, and then hitting Shift D to duplicate and move that eye over. Maybe scale that down a bit, maybe scale a little bit in the X, and position it here. Now don't worry about anything overlapping. You want it positioned correctly, because then all you have to do is say select a vertex here, hit X to delete it, and select another vertex here and hit X. And then you can select the vertex of the curve or the stroke that we no longer require, hit L, and then delete all those points. And so now we've got these nice two eyes. Now at any point, when you've got lines that overlap or intersect, going into edit mode is very, very simple. Select the vertex on the line that you wish to delete. So here we've obviously got two. I'm going to delete the nearest one, and I'm just going to edit that curve over here. And I can just sort of massage those points into place very, very easily. This. So if you get gaps that are unwanted, you can always just pull those strokes back into place to kind of connect up a little bit more easily until you've got something that you're satisfied with. Now once you're satisfied with your inks, the cleanup process is fairly time consuming, and it involves a lot of editing and a lot of repetition until you've got something that you really want. So for example, say you've got an end of a curve over here that you don't quite like how it caps. Selecting it and hitting Alt S while in proportional editing mode will taper that line back. And here are my final inks. Now I did a lot of tweaking that I didn't end up recording, but basically the process was just repeating what you've seen. I've gone and done a few things like added a few extra strokes on the eyelid here and on the nose to sort of delineate where the shading will be. A lot more contouring on the hair, cleaning up a lot of the clothes, so on and so forth. Now these highlights here on the layer that you're seeing here are actually inked in with a vertex coloring of white so that they match the background. Now, let's say we went to a gray background, you can sort of see those highlights there, but because we're going to be putting colors under this, it sort of doesn't really make a difference, and it sort of keeps those highlights on the inks layer. And so I'll be leaving this tutorial at this point here. The next tutorial will be focusing on coloring and shading. It's a very involved process, and I really want to take the time to explore value systems and using the airbrush and how to get nice bright shadows, all of that good stuff. It's going to require a little bit of intermediate knowledge, but I think it's stuff that you guys are really going to level up once you've learned those techniques. I'm really looking forward to sharing that with you, but for now, this is where we're going to be leaving our portrait. So I hope you got a lot out of that tutorial today. Of course, if you find what you saw here today really useful and want to see more upcoming videos, do consider subscribing to my YouTube channel. And if you're feeling at all generous, head on over to Patreon. It's the support over on Patreon which makes the production of these videos possible. Thanks for watching, everyone. Bye for now.